She grabbed a stranger's arm to escape her ex. She didn't know he was the most dangerous man in New York. She thought she was saving herself from humiliation. She had no idea she was stepping into a war. One desperate touch, one dance, one night that destroyed the life she had carefully rebuilt and replaced it with something she never asked for and couldn't walk away from. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will keep you up all night. The dress was a mistake. That was the first thought Amani Brooks had when she stepped through the gilded entrance of the Manhattan Legacy Gala and felt 200 pairs of eyes slide across her body like a slow tide. Not hostile eyes, not entirely. Manhattan's elite had been trained too well for naked hostility, but assessing eyes, the kind that measured and cataloged and filed her away in whatever mental drawer they kept for women who looked like her. Too much, too visible, too present in a space where presence itself was a currency she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to spend. She almost turned around. She didn't. The dress was emerald green, deep and saturated, the kind of color that didn't apologize for existing. It wrapped around every curve of her body without negotiation, without the architectural tricks she'd spent years hiding behind, the strategic draping, the carefully angled wraps, the dark colors that were supposed to make her smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. She'd bought those dresses. She'd worn every single one of them. And standing in her bathroom 3 hours ago, staring at herself in the full-length mirror with the emerald gown finally on, she'd made a decision that felt less like confidence and more like exhaustion. She was tired of hiding, just tired. So she left the safe dress hanging in the closet, and she came here instead, and now the chandeliers were throwing gold light across her shoulders, and the room was loud with the clink of crystal and low, important laughter, and Amani Brooks stood at the threshold of it all and breathed. In, out. She was 31 years old. She'd spent 3 of those years letting a man systematically dismantle her. She'd spent the 2 years after that putting herself back together, one small decision at a time. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of that. Her nonprofit, Rooted, a mentorship organization connecting young Black women in New York with professional networks in the arts, had been nominated for the Legacy Foundation's Community Impact Award. It was the kind of recognition that opened doors, real doors, the kind that led somewhere. She was not supposed to be afraid of a dress. So Amani squared her shoulders, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and walked into the room. The Manhattan Legacy Gala occupied the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, a space so aggressively opulent it felt almost like a dare. Crystal chandeliers descended from coffered ceilings in cascading tiers. Round tables draped in ivory linen held centerpieces of white orchids and gold candlesticks. The floor gleamed. The walls breathed old money. Around her moved the architecture of New York power. Tech billionaires in custom suits standing next to city council members who stood next to gallery owners, who stood next to hedge fund managers, who stood next to the kind of people whose exact jobs were never quite clear, but whose net worth was never in question. Imani navigated it all with the practiced ease of someone who'd attended enough of these events to know the choreography. She smiled at the right moments. She shook the right hands. She found her colleague Dara near the bar. Dara, who ran the arts programming side of Rooted. Dara, who was wearing a gold wrap dress and already on her second drink and radiating the specific energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed these things. And they stood together for a while, talking through the evening, orienting themselves, making a plan. "You look stunning," Dara said, looking Amani up and down with open appreciation. "I mean that. That dress is serious." "It's too much," Amani said, without meaning to. Dara looked at her with the flat, patient expression she reserved for statements that didn't deserve agreement. "It's exactly enough. Stop." Amani drank her champagne. She was halfway through a conversation with one of the Legacy Foundation's board members about the nomination when she felt it, that specific crawl across the back of her neck that she associated with bad news, the kind of feeling that arrived before the conscious mind caught up. Her eyes moved on their own, scanning the room, and then she found him and her stomach dropped through the floor. Ethan Caldwell stood 40 feet away, near the far end of the bar, looking exactly the way he always looked, polished to a degree that bordered on aggressive, expensive suit, that particular expression of easy confidence that she now recognized as performance, as armor, as the careful construction of a man who needed to be the most important person in every room he entered. He was talking to someone. His hand moved through the air in that gesture she remembered, that chopping emphasis he used when he was making a point he considered unassailable. 3 years. She had loved him for 3 years. Or she had loved the idea of him. The version he'd presented in the beginning, before the small comments started. Before the dinner party where he'd laughed at something she said in a way that made the whole table uncertain whether it was a joke. Before the morning he'd watched her get dressed and said, very casually, as if commenting on the weather, that she might want to reconsider the blouse. Before the slow, surgical erosion of her certainty about herself that he'd performed so consistently and so quietly that by the time she recognized it, she wasn't sure there was a self left to be certain about. She'd left him on a Tuesday in November 2 years ago in the kitchen of the apartment they'd shared while it rained outside the window. He'd cried. He'd told her she was making a mistake. He'd told her, and this was the one she still heard sometimes in dark moments, that she was going to have a hard time finding someone who was willing to put in the effort that he had. She'd taken her keys and walked out, and now he was here, 40 feet away, and he was turning. His eyes found her. For a half second, nothing registered on his face. Then she watched the recognition land, and after recognition came the smile. Slow and knowing and laced with something proprietary, as if she were a possession he'd misplaced and was pleased to have spotted again. He began walking toward her. Imani's heart rate spiked. She felt it in her throat, felt the champagne glass grow slippery in her palm. Around her the party continued its elegant rotation, indifferent and relentless, offering no exits. Dara had stepped away minutes ago. The board member she'd been speaking to had been pulled into another conversation. She was standing alone in a green dress that suddenly felt like a spotlight, and Ethan Caldwell was moving through the crowd toward her with that smile still on his face, and she absolutely could not stand here and let him approach her with 200 witnesses and have this conversation. She moved, not toward the exit. The exit was behind him, cut off. Not toward the restrooms. Same problem. She moved laterally, deeper into the crowd, angling toward the far side of the ballroom where clusters of guests stood thick enough to lose herself in. Her heels were wrong for speed. The champagne glass was still in her hand because abandoning it felt too abrupt, too visible, a signal that she was running, and she refused to let Ethan Caldwell make her run. She wasn't running. She was simply moving with great purpose in the opposite direction. She glanced back once. He was still coming. Unhurried, cutting through the crowd with the ease of a man who'd never once considered that someone might not want to see him. Imani turned back forward and nearly walked directly into a man's chest. She stopped herself, one hand coming up to brace against the impact, and the hand landed on an arm. A forearm, to be specific. Solid. Still. The man attached to it hadn't moved at all, hadn't flinched, hadn't stepped back. He simply stood there with the absolute stillness of someone who'd stopped being startled by things a long time ago. She looked up. He was tall. Genuinely tall. Not New York party tall, but the kind of height that reorganized the space around him. Korean, mid-30s, sharp-featured in a way that suggested precision rather than beauty, though the combination landed somewhere close to both. Dark suit, no tie, top button open. The only concession to the evening's dress code that suggested he was here on his own terms and had made whatever adjustments he deemed necessary. His expression was entirely neutral, not cold, not warm, neutral in the specific way of someone who had complete control over what they showed and showed only what they chose. His eyes were very dark, and they were looking at her with an attention that was neither the sliding assessment she'd felt at the door, nor the ownership she'd seen on Ethan's face. It was something else. The attention of someone who was genuinely looking, without agenda, without preliminary conclusions. Behind her, she could feel Ethan closing the distance. "Please," she said. The word came out quieter than she intended, rougher. "Just dance with me. My ex is behind me and I can't—" She stopped, swallowed. The sentence didn't need finishing. "Please." A moment passed. He extended his hand. She took it. He led her onto the dance floor with an ease that suggested he'd done exactly this. Moved through rooms, through situations, through unpredictable variables, without hesitation, without consulting anyone, for a very long time. His right hand settled at her waist, and he pulled her into the waltz with a control that was nothing like the fumbling adjustment she'd expected from a stranger improvising. "Breathe," he said. His voice was low, accented, unhurried. "I'm breathing," she said. "You're not," she breathed. The champagne glass was gone. She wasn't sure when she'd set it down. His hand was at her waist, steady and certain, and they were moving to the orchestra, and across the room she caught a glimpse of Ethan stopping at the edge of the dance floor, his trajectory interrupted, his expression recalibrating. "He's watching," she said. "I know. How do you—" "Because I watched him watching you for the last 4 minutes before you moved." He turned them smoothly, and Ethan disappeared from her sightline. "He's not someone you're afraid of physically." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "No, it's not that." "Something else, then." "Something else," she agreed. He didn't push. They danced. The orchestra was playing something slow and European that Amani couldn't have named, and the room turned around them, and she became aware by degrees of something she hadn't expected, that she felt calm. Not the performed calm of gritting her teeth and getting through it, actual calm, settling into her chest and shoulders, like a hand pressing down gently on something that had been wound too tight. "I'm Imani," she said. "Imani Brooks." "Kang Min Jae," he said. She didn't recognize the name. She should have known, she'd think later, that this was the first sign she was out of her depth, that she could hear a name like that in a room like this and feel nothing but mild curiosity. "Do you actually know how to waltz, or are you improvising?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Both." "That's a terrible answer." "It's an honest one." She almost laughed. The almost laugh surprised her, moved through her chest like a small, unexpected thing, and she felt the last coil of tension in her shoulders release by another degree. She looked up at him, and he was already looking at her. Not past her, not over her head, not at the room around them, but at her. It was the most disorienting thing, the absolute directness of it. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "You carry yourself well, for someone who nearly walked into my chest a minute ago." "That was graceful," she said. "I was going for graceful." This time the expression shifted fully. A brief, controlled flicker of something genuine. It lasted approximately 2 seconds, and then the neutrality returned, but she'd seen it and filed it away as the first real thing he'd shown her. The song was reaching its final measures when she felt rather than saw the approach. That same prickling across her neck, but different now. Less fear and more the awareness of an audience. Ethan had moved to the edge of the floor. She felt Min Jae's hand at her waist shift slightly, a small repositioning that felt deliberate, and then they completed the final turn and came to a stop, and Ethan was standing right there, 3 feet away, with his hands in his pockets, and that smile doing its particular work on his face. "Imani," he said. The way he said her name, warm and familiar, as if they'd parted well, as if he were entitled to that familiarity, made her jaw tighten. "Ethan, you look—" His eyes moved down and up, performing the evaluation with just enough slowness to make the point. "Brave." There it was. She knew every instrument in his orchestra by now. Brave. Not beautiful, not stunning, not any of the words that would have been neutral and kind. Brave. The word that acknowledged the dress and simultaneously questioned whether it should have been worn, that reframed confidence as a decision requiring courage, which implied that the default assumption should be something other than confidence. He'd spent 3 years constructing these instruments and tuning them to her frequency, and he'd deployed one inside 15 seconds, and part of her, the old tired part, still felt it land. But before she could formulate a response, Min Jae spoke. "Caldwell," he said. Ethan blinked. The smile stayed, but the confidence behind it flickered. "Do we know each other?" "We know of each other," Min Jae said. His voice hadn't changed. Same low register, same unhurried pace. But something in it had shifted in a way that Imani felt in the air around them. "I've heard your name in connection with the Meridian Group's development proposal on the west side. You're their legal counsel." "I am," Ethan said, recovering his footing, the lawyer in him reasserting itself. "The proposal has some problems," Min Jae said. "Structural issues. Zoning irregularities. The kind that tend to become very public, very inconveniently, when someone finds the right moment to surface them." A pause. Just a half-second pause, measured and surgical. "I'd focus your attention there if I were you. A man with your reputation can't afford to be attached to the wrong project." The room around them had not stopped moving. The party continued. No one was watching. But in the small radius of the 3 of them, the temperature had dropped several degrees, and Ethan Caldwell, who had walked to the edge of this dance floor with absolute confidence in his own power, was now doing very quiet, very rapid calculations behind his eyes. "Right," he said. One word, carefully chosen. Good to see you, Imani. And he left, just like that. He turned and he walked away and he didn't look back, and Imani stood at the edge of the dance floor with the orchestra beginning a new piece and her heart hammering, and something fierce and clean moving through her that she hadn't felt in a very long time. She turned to Minjae. What was that? She asked. He needed to understand that the approach wasn't worth the outcome, Minjae said. He'd already picked 2 fresh glasses of champagne from a passing tray and was extending one to her. You don't even know what he did. I don't need to. He looked at her. He came here to make you feel small in a room full of people. The reason doesn't matter. She took the glass. Her hand was almost steady. The Meridian Group, she said. Do they actually have zoning problems, or did you... Every development project in Manhattan has zoning irregularities, he said. Whether they're a problem depends entirely on whether someone decides to notice them. She looked at him for a long moment. You're good at that. At what? Making something sound like information when it's actually a warning. The almost smile again. You're perceptive. Occupational requirement, she said. I run a nonprofit. I spend most of my time in rooms with people who are trying to get something from me while sounding like they're offering something. And what am I offering? He asked. There was genuine curiosity in it, underneath the controlled surface. I don't know yet, she said honestly. A dance. Apparently the public destruction of my ex-boyfriend's confidence. I haven't tallied the full scope. He made a sound that might have been a quiet laugh. She couldn't be entirely sure. They stood together for a while after that, moving through the outer edges of the party rather than its center, the way 2 people do when they've found an unexpected equilibrium and are unwilling to break it by doing the normal things, circulating, networking, performing the social functions that had brought them both here. She told him about Rooted, about the nomination, about the work. He listened in a way that felt substantive, asking questions that weren't polite filler, but actual questions, the kind that indicated he'd processed what she'd said before asking. He told her when she asked that he was in real estate and private investment. He said it simply, without the usual Manhattan embellishments. No names of firms dropped, no notable deals referenced for status. Something nagged at her about that simplicity. She filed it away. The evening turned on its elegant axis. Around 10 o'clock, they found themselves on one of the hotel's private balconies. She'd needed air, the ballroom was warm, and he'd followed naturally without making it feel like following. The city opened below them in its nighttime configuration, the grid of lights extending south to the water, the sound of it rising in a low, constant hum. She'd lived here her whole life, and she still wasn't immune to what it looked like from height. How long have you been in New York? She asked. 15 years, he said. Since I was 20. Do you still see it like this? Or does it just become the place where you live? He considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to give everything. Both, he said, the same way you can know someone completely and still find them surprising. She looked at him sideways. That's almost poetic. Don't tell anyone. She was smiling at that, genuinely smiling, the unguarded kind, when the balcony door opened. The man who stepped through was compact, Korean, dressed in a dark suit that was slightly less tailored than it should have been for this event. The suit of someone who'd gotten dressed for a different purpose and adjusted at the last moment. His eyes moved to Minjae immediately, and the expression on his face was one that Imani, even in her limited experience, could identify. The expression of someone delivering news that couldn't wait. Minjae's posture changed. Nothing dramatic, just a fraction of a degree, the body tightening, the attention redirecting. He turned slightly away from Imani and said something brief in Korean that she didn't catch. The man responded in Korean, low and rapid, and the words ran together into meaninglessness for her, except for two. She caught them because they were pronounced with an emphasis that stood apart from the surrounding sentences, stressed the way words get stressed when they carry weight. She didn't know what they meant, but she felt their meaning in the quality of the silence that followed them. Minjae asked a short question. The man answered. Minjae asked another. Then he turned back to her and his face was entirely composed, perfectly arranged, and she looked at it and knew with absolute certainty that something had just broken open. I apologize, he said. I need to address something. Of course, she said, because what else do you say on a balcony at a gala? He didn't move immediately. His eyes stayed on her face, and there was something in them. Not hesitation. Minjae didn't strike her as a man who hesitated, but something more like assessment, the rapid calculation of variables. Then he said quietly and very precisely, How much Korean do you speak? She frowned. None. Why? His jaw moved slightly. She watched the decision move through him. Stay here, he said. Don't go back inside yet. I'll be 2 minutes. He went back through the door with the other man, and the door closed, and Imani stood on the balcony alone with the city spread below her and the sound of the party muffled through the glass, and she became aware, in that specific way that arrives before understanding does, in the body before the mind, that something was wrong. She waited 30 seconds. Then she followed him. The door opened into a narrow service corridor that ran alongside the main ballroom, dimly lit and empty of guests. She could hear their voices around the first corner, not loud, not raised, the opposite of raised, that particular controlled quiet that is somehow more alarming than shouting. And she stopped where she was, out of their sight line, and listened. She caught fragments. Her Korean was exactly as she'd told him. None. But the other man was speaking partly in English, switching between the two languages mid-sentence in the way bilinguals do under stress, when the right word arrives faster in the other language. 3 of ours in the warehouse district. Volkov moved earlier than... Chen says the shipment never reached... Dimitri's people. Has to be. The timing. Boss. If they know about the Sullivan Street location... Boss. Imani stood very still in the corridor. We need to move now. All of it. If they've compromised, how many? Min Jae's voice, flat and cold in a way she hadn't heard before. A pause. Then, in English, 3 confirmed dead, Park and the 2 younger ones. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Imani processed the word dead and the word Volkov and the word boss and the particular way that Min Jae had not, for even a fraction of a moment, sounded surprised. She took 1 step back. Then another. The emerald dress caught the light from the single corridor lamp, and she was suddenly acutely conscious of how visible she was, how present, how thoroughly she had stepped into a geography she had no map for. The man on the dance floor who had held her with steady hands and said, "Breathe," and dismantled Ethan Caldwell with 7 words and almost laughed twice in 40 minutes. He was not in real estate. He turned the corner and found her standing there. They looked at each other. How much did you hear? He said. Her voice when it came was steadier than she expected. Enough. He studied her face. She had the impression he was doing it the way he did everything, completely, without hurrying, cataloging every detail. Then he said, "Come with me." I don't think... Imani. Her name in his mouth, direct and quiet. Come with me now. I'll explain everything, but not here. Who are the Volkov? She asked. Even though part of her already understood, she didn't want the answer. His expression told her everything before his words did. People who now know your face, he said, because you spent 2 hours at my side in front of every camera in that ballroom. The party sounds drifted through the wall. Glasses, laughter. The orchestra beginning another song. What does that mean? She asked, though her chest was already tightening around the answer. It means, Min Jae said, that the life you came here with tonight is not the life you're leaving with. Down the corridor, she could hear the other man speaking rapidly into a phone. Outside, through the thick hotel walls, New York continued its indifferent roar. Imani stood in a service corridor in a green dress holding the ruins of a perfectly ordinary evening and looked at the man in front of her. Really looked at him, past the composed face and the dark eyes and the controlled stillness, and understood, with the cold precision of a fact arriving too late to be useful, that she had grabbed hold of something tonight without knowing what she was grabbing, and now it was holding on back. He didn't wait for her to agree. That was the thing she would come back to later, in the small hours of the night when the details of the evening arranged themselves into a sequence she could actually examine. He didn't ask again, didn't negotiate, didn't give her the space to make a rational decision the way a normal person would. He simply turned and walked, and something in the way he moved communicated with total clarity that the walking was happening with or without her, and that the with was the only version of events in which she had any protection at all. So she followed, not because she trusted him. She was clear about that with herself, even then, even in the first few seconds of following him down the service corridor with her heels ringing against the concrete floor and the party sounds fading behind them. She followed because the alternative was standing alone in a hotel corridor, knowing that somewhere in the building, or outside it, or watching it from a car on the street, were people who had seen her face, and who now associated that face with the man she was following, and who had apparently just killed 3 people in a warehouse district she'd never heard of. That was the calculus. It wasn't trust. It was arithmetic. The corridor opened into a service elevator lobby. Min Jae's man, she didn't know his name yet, would learn it was Seo Jin, was already there, phone at his ear, speaking in rapid Korean with the particular clipped urgency of someone coordinating moving parts. He looked at Imani when they entered the lobby, and something passed across his face. Not hostility exactly, but assessment, the rapid measurement of a variable he hadn't planned for. He said something to Min Jae in Korean. Min Jae answered without looking at him, pressing the elevator call button with one finger. "What did he say?" Imani asked. "That you're a complication." "And what did you say?" "The complications are managed, not avoided." The elevator arrived. The 3 of them got in. The doors closed and the car began to descend, and Imani stood with her back against the mirrored wall and watched Min Jae's reflection watching hers, and the silence between them was dense with everything that hadn't been said yet. "Tell me what's happening," she said. "I will. Now. Tell me now." He looked at her reflection. "When we're in a controlled space. I'm not getting into a car with you without... You're already in an elevator with me. Not unkind. Just factual. The way a man states facts when he's decided that facts are all that's useful. The car is the next step. It's the same principle. It's not the same... Imani." The elevator hit a sublevel and the doors opened into an underground parking structure, and Min Jae turned and looked at her directly, not at her reflection. "I understand this is frightening. I understand you have no reason to trust me. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to make a practical decision. And the practical decision is that you are less safe standing here than you are moving." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. 4. He didn't look away, didn't soften it, didn't add anything to make it easier to swallow. "Fine," she said, "but you talk in the car." "All of it." "All of it," he agreed. The car was black, armored in a way that wasn't immediately obvious from the outside, but that she felt in the weight of the door when Seo Jin opened it. The particular resistance of reinforced steel dressed up in civilian clothing. 2 other men materialized from somewhere in the parking structure, falling into position with the practiced ease of a choreography they'd performed many times. They didn't speak to her. They barely looked at her. They moved the way security moves when security is the only thing standing between whatever they're protecting and something that actually intends harm. She got in. The car moved up and out of the structure and into the street, and New York received them, the late-night version, the version that never fully quieted, cabs and bodega lights, and the particular amber glow of a city that runs on a different schedule than the rest of the world. Imani sat in the back seat with Min Jae beside her and Seo Jin in the front passenger seat and watched the city slide past the window and waited. "The Volkov Syndicate," Min Jae said, without preamble. "Russian organized crime. They've operated in New York for about 12 years, originally focused on Brighton Beach and the surrounding boroughs, but they've been expanding aggressively for the past 3 years. New leadership, Dmitry Volkov, the founder's nephew. Younger, more ambitious, less patient. And what do they want with you? Territory, money, the same things everyone in this city wants, just with fewer intermediaries." He paused. "My organization controls significant infrastructure in Lower Manhattan and the waterfront districts, logistics, shipping, certain supply chains that are difficult to replicate. The Volkov want what we've built. They've been applying pressure for 6 months, incrementally. Tonight they escalated. By killing 3 people. 3 of my people," he said. The qualifier was quiet, but absolute. She absorbed that. "And me? You became visible tonight." He said it without apology, which she found she almost preferred to apology. At least it was honest. Every event like tonight's gala is photographed extensively. Society pages, foundation records, personal social media. By morning, there will be images of us dancing distributed across a dozen platforms. The Volkov monitor those images. They've been monitoring anything associated with me for months. So they'll see my face. They've probably already seen your face. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window. Outside, a cab leaned on its horn. 2 women were laughing outside a restaurant, lit by the warm spill of light from inside, and the image was so ordinary, so completely unaware of itself, that it hit her somewhere in the sternum. "I have a life," she said. "I have an office on the Lower East Side and 12 staff members, and a nomination event tomorrow morning, and..." She stopped. The sentence was collapsing under its own weight. "This isn't my world." "I know," he said. Don't say that like it's a small thing. I'm not saying it like a small thing. He was looking at her and his expression was not soft. Min Jae's face didn't do soft, but there was something in it, some acknowledgement. I'm saying it because it's true. You walked into something you had no reason to expect, and I'm telling you the truth about what that means. You deserve the truth. What it means, she said flatly, is that I grabbed a stranger's arm at a party, and now people want to hurt me. It means that, yes. And you're taking me where? My building. Upper East Side. It's secure, but significantly more secure than your apartment, which, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, which we'll need to address. She turned from the window to look at him. What does that mean, address? Seojin said something from the front seat. Min Jae's jaw tightened slightly. He said something back. What did he say? Imani asked. And when Min Jae didn't answer immediately, I will ask this every single time until you either answer me or teach me Korean. Your choice. The almost expression, 1/2 second, buried. He said that there's a vehicle that's been following us since we left the hotel. The warmth went out of the air in the back seat. Imani didn't turn to look through the rear window. She didn't know why exactly. Some instinct told her that turning was the wrong move, the thing that revealed what you knew. So she stayed still and kept her eyes on Min Jae's face instead and said, very quietly, How long? Since the hotel, Seojin said, in English this time. His accent was heavier than Min Jae's. 2 cars back, silver sedan. Options? Min Jae said. Harrison already knows he's rerouting 5 minutes to the secondary location. Min Jae nodded once and turned back to Imani. We're changing course, he said. It's a precaution. A precaution, she repeated. There's a car following us, and that's a precaution. Until I know whether they're maintaining distance or intending to close it, yes. She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that felt mechanical, like a clock she couldn't stop hearing. You're very calm, she said. One of us should be. That's not actually comforting. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be functional. The car turned and turned again, navigating a route she didn't recognize, the familiar grid of the city rearranging itself into something she couldn't track. Seojin was on the phone again. Min Jae was very still beside her, and she understood now that his stillness wasn't passivity. It was concentration, the way a circuit concentrates power before it discharges. They arrived at a building that looked from the outside like any other residential tower on the Upper East Side. Glass and steel, doorman lobby, the understated enormity of serious money. But the approach was different. The car descended into a private garage rather than stopping at the street entrance, and the men who met them there moved with the same choreographed efficiency as the ones at the hotel. 2 of them she didn't recognize. One of them she did, Park Jun. She'd learn his name later, but she recognized his face because she'd seen it twice at the gala, once near the bar and once near the main entrance, without registering it consciously, the way you don't register things you have no frame for. He spoke to Min Jae in Korean. Whatever he said changed the temperature of the room. Min Jae's expression didn't break. She was learning that it almost never fully broke. But something in it shifted, the way ice shifts when the ground beneath it moves. He turned to Seojin and asked a short question. Seojin answered with 2 words that Imani didn't need translated because the weight of them was identical in any language. Min Jae stood very still for 5 seconds. Then he said, in English to no one in particular, Confirm it. Already confirmed, Park said, in English, glancing at Imani briefly. Came through 20 minutes ago. He was at the gala tonight. Same room. Who was at the gala? Imani asked. The question came out steady, which surprised her. No one answered immediately. Min Jae was looking at Park. Park was looking at Min Jae. Seojin was looking at the middle distance with an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. Who? She said again, and it wasn't a question this time. Min Jae looked at her. Ethan Caldwell, he said. She heard it and didn't move. Let it sit in the air between them. He's not just a lawyer, Min Jae continued. He's been on the Volkov's payroll for approximately 18 months. Financial services, specifically running money through a network of nonprofit fronts and small investment firms, making their capital look legitimate. The word nonprofit landed inside her chest like something thrown. Nonprofits, she said. Charity vehicles, primarily. Arts organizations. Community foundations. Industries where the money can move in smaller amounts without attracting the kind of scrutiny that larger transactions draw. He paused. He would have had significant access to the ecosystem you work in, your world. She thought about every conversation she'd had with Ethan about her work, the interest he'd shown, genuine interest, she'd thought, the kind of attention that made her feel seen and heard, the questions he'd asked about the organizations she'd partnered with, the funders she'd cultivated, the events she'd attended. She'd read it as love. She had read it as love. He used me, she said, not a revelation, a confirmation. But there was something different about confirmation. It had weight that revelation didn't, a solidity, a settling. He may have, Min-jae said carefully. We don't yet know the full scope of, he used me. She said it again, not louder, not with more emotion, just with more certainty. For 3 years I thought, she stopped, pressed her fingers together. How long have you known this? I've known about his connection to the Volkov for approximately 3 weeks. I didn't know who he was to you until tonight. And if you had known, before tonight? He met her eyes. I would have found a way to tell you. Would you? Yes. Why? Because you deserve to know. She looked at him for a long time. He held the look without flinching, without adding to it, without performing sincerity. Just held it, the way he held everything, completely, without pretense. I want to go home, she said. I know. I want to go home and I want to call my assistant and cancel tomorrow's event, and I want to sit in my apartment and, I don't know, process this. Like a normal person. I know, he said again. But I can't. No. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, the breath of someone who has just accepted a weight they weren't planning to carry. So what now? Min-jae looked at Seo Jin, then back at her. Now you come upstairs. I have people who will make sure your staff and your office are protected tonight. Your assistant will be contacted by someone I trust, not with details, but enough to ensure the morning event is handled without you present and without raising questions. And me? You stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we reassess. Tomorrow you reassess, she said. I want to be part of that conversation. Something moved in his face. You will be. I'm not a... She searched for the word. I'm not cargo. I'm not a complication to be managed. No, he said, with a quiet firmness that felt different from agreement, felt more like correction. You're not. She held that for a moment. One more question, she said. Yes, the thing you said at the gala, about the Meridian Group, about their zoning irregularities. She watched his face. Was that about Ethan? Did you already know who he was when you said it? The pause that followed was extremely brief, but she caught it. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly, processed the geometry of that, the fact that she'd grabbed his arm not knowing who he was, and he'd danced with her knowing exactly who Ethan was and what he was connected to, and he'd done it anyway, had said those words on the dance floor that sent Ethan away with his confidence restructured, and had done all of it while carrying information that directly concerned her life without her knowledge. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he agreed. At the gala, before any of this. Yes. Why didn't you? He took a breath, man. The first time she'd seen him breathe in a way that looked like something other than a mechanical function. Because I wasn't certain yet, and because telling you in a room full of people with no protection and no time to process it was not... He stopped. It wasn't the right way. And this is the right way, finding out in a parking garage? No, he said, simply and without defense. There was no right way. There was only less wrong. She looked at him. He looked back. In the silence of the garage, surrounded by men she didn't know, in a building she'd never been to, in a city that had just rearranged its entire character around her in the span of 4 hours, Amani Brooks made the kind of decision that isn't really a decision, more like a recognition that the path behind you has already disappeared, and the only direction left is forward. If I stay tonight, she said, I need my phone. I need to contact my assistant myself, and I need you to answer every question I ask. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient. When I ask. Agreed, he said. And I need to know one more thing right now before we go upstairs. Ask it. She looked him directly in the eye. Is Ethan in danger? Min-jae's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness altered in a way she was beginning to be able to read. The way the stillness compressed, like pressure building behind a sealed door. From the Volkov? He said. Possibly. Once an asset becomes a liability. From you, she said. Is he in danger from you? The pause stretched for 2 full seconds. That depends, Min-jae said carefully, on the choices he makes in the next 24 hours. It was not the answer she wanted. She understood, standing there in the cold fluorescence of the parking garage, with the weight of the evening pressing down on every surface of her, that it was probably the most honest answer he could give, and that honesty and comfort were 2 different currencies entirely, and that she was going to have to decide which one she needed more. She picked up the hem of her green dress so it wouldn't drag on the concrete floor. "Upstairs," she said. They went. The elevator rose through the building's dark core, and Amani watched the numbers climb and thought about Ethan. Not the Ethan of the last 2 years, the one she'd been healing from, but the earlier one, the one who'd made her laugh on a Thursday afternoon in a coffee shop on Bleecker Street, the one who'd read her grant proposals and told her they were brilliant, the one whose attention had felt, for a long time, like arriving somewhere she'd always meant to be. That man had been a construction, a performance. The world she thought she'd briefly, almost, inhabited with him, that had been a stage. And now here she was, in a different theater entirely, with a different man, in a different kind of danger, and the orchestra was still playing somewhere far below her as the elevator doors opened into a penthouse that looked out across the entirety of Manhattan and the East River and the dark sprawl of the boroughs beyond. She stepped out of the elevator. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, 1 text message. It read, "We saw you dancing. We know who you are. Tell him we want a meeting. Tell him he has 48 hours. And then underneath that, a photograph. Her apartment building, taken tonight. The timestamp read 43 minutes ago, while she was still at the gala, while she was still on the balcony talking about the city, and almost laughing at something Min-jae had said, while she was still believing, in some residual way, that the evening could be recovered and returned to normal. Someone had been standing outside her home. Min-jae was already beside her, reading the screen over her shoulder. She felt the change in him before she saw it. The atmosphere around him went tight and cold, like air before a storm front arrives. "Give me the phone," he said. She handed it to him, and her hand was steady, and she was deeply, almost clinically aware that the steadiness was the specific steadiness of shock, the body running on backup systems because the primary ones had just received too much at once. Min-jae looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked up at Seo-jin, and the look that passed between them was the kind that didn't need language. "Lock it down," he said. "Everything, now." The room that had been almost quiet exploded into motion. Phones, voices, the low, rapid pulse of men coordinating under pressure. And Amani stood at the center of it with Manhattan spread below her through floor-to-ceiling glass and the green dress still on her body and the full understanding, arriving like cold water, that 48 hours was not very much time at all. The penthouse was all glass and controlled light, the kind of space that had been designed to make power look effortless. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, Manhattan spreading out below in its cold, indifferent grid. The furniture was spare and dark, nothing decorative, nothing that served a purpose beyond function. It was not a home. It was a position. Amani sat on the edge of a low couch and held a glass of water she hadn't asked for and didn't drink. Someone had given it to her in the way people give things to people in crisis, the gesture a substitute for something more useful. Across the room, Min-jae was at a long table that had been converted into a command surface, laptops open, phones active, 3 men moving around him with the coordinated urgency of people executing a plan that was already in motion before she'd stepped off the elevator. The photograph was still in her mind. Her building? The timestamp. 43 minutes ago. She set the water glass down on the low table in front of her and stood up. "I need to know what's happening," she said, to the room in general, loud enough to cut through the noise. Min-jae looked up from the table. He said something to Seo-jin, who nodded and stepped back, and then Min-jae walked over to her. Not rushing, the way he never rushed. The way that was beginning to feel less like calm and more like a specific kind of discipline. The kind that gets built over years of situations where panic is a luxury you cannot afford. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." He looked at her for a moment, then pulled a chair from nearby and sat himself, which rearranged the geometry enough that she sat too, without quite deciding to. Old social reflex. She noted it and was annoyed by it. The text came from a number we've already traced to a burner purchased in Queens 3 days ago, he said, which means they planned the contact in advance. They expected us to leave together tonight. They expected it, she said. Before you approached me, yes. He said it without softening it. The gala was a calculated moment for them. They knew I would be there. They intended to use whatever happened as leverage. So I was, incidental? Any woman who... No. He cut it off, not sharply, but cleanly. If you'd walked away after the first dance, they would have noted you and moved on. The fact that you stayed. The fact that we were on the balcony together. The time. He paused. They saw something they could use. She turned that over. The nausea of it. Not that she'd been targeted, but that she'd been watched, measured, evaluated as a potential instrument without her knowledge, by people who moved through the world like that, calculating the usable weight of every human being they observed. The 48 hours, she said. What do they want from a meeting? A negotiation on territory. They've been trying to force a formal sit-down for 3 months. I've refused every approach because sit-downs with the Volkov have a history of ending badly for the non-Volkov party. His jaw moved slightly. Using you to compel attendance is a way around that refusal. So I'm the leverage. Yes. She sat with that. And the people they killed tonight? Your men in the warehouse? A demonstration, he said. Same purpose. Show capacity. Show willingness. Create urgency. His voice was flat, but she was watching his face now, and she saw something move behind his eyes when he said it. Fast and dark, there and gone, like something passing underwater. Grief, maybe, or the specific weight of responsibility that looks like grief from certain angles. Park was 24 years old, he said, mostly to himself. He'd been with us for 8 months. The room was loud with activity, and yet between them there was a small, sealed quiet. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. Not deflecting, not brushing it off the way she'd expected. He just looked at her and nodded once, and accepted it. We're also monitoring your office building and your apartment remotely, he said, returning to function. Nobody's been inside. The photograph was surveillance, not entry, but we're treating it as a boundary that's already been crossed. Meaning? Meaning, you shouldn't go back there alone until this is resolved. How long does resolve take? He didn't answer immediately, and she understood that the non-answer was itself an answer. We work on the 48-hour window first, he said. What happens after depends on what we find. What you find, she said. What are you looking for? He stood, and she read the motion as the end of the personal portion of the conversation. The pivot back to operational, back to the table with the laptops and the men moving around it. But then he stopped and turned back. Ethan's financial network, he said. The structure he built for the Volkov. We have fragments, shell companies, a few nonprofit vehicles we've identified, but not the full architecture. If we can map it completely, we have leverage of our own. The Volkov's operation runs on clean money. Expose the pipes, you threaten the water. She stared at him. And you think I can help with that? I think you know the nonprofit ecosystem in this city better than most people in this room, he said. I think 3 years with Ethan Caldwell gave you a level of exposure to his professional world that my people don't have access to. And I think, he paused, I think you want to understand what he did, not just that he did it, the shape of it. She hated that he was right. She hated the accuracy of it, how cleanly it landed against the part of her that was still processing the revelation at the garage. Not the danger, not the photograph, but Ethan. The nonprofits, the questions he'd asked, the interest that had felt like love. Get me a laptop, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He turned to Seojin and said something, and Seojin brought a laptop and set it on the low table in front of her without comment. She started working. The night moved around her in layers. At the main table, Min-jae coordinated with his people in the controlled language of a man managing a crisis with practiced precision. Imani worked through donor records, publicly available nonprofit filings, financial disclosures, the infrastructure of the philanthropic world that she'd spent years building fluency in. She pulled Form 990 GIOs, cross-referenced board memberships, traced the same names appearing in multiple organizations and configurations that would look normal to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She knew what she was looking at. An organization called the Halloran Foundation appeared in 3 separate donor acknowledgement lists, connected to events Ethan had attended over the past 2 years. It had a website, spare, professional, the kind that communicated legitimacy without inviting scrutiny. Its listed mission was arts education for underserved youth in the outer boroughs. Its board of directors consisted of 4 names, 3 of which she cross-referenced to 2 other foundations with overlapping structures. The 4th name was one she recognized. She stopped. "Min-jae?" she said. He was at the table 20 feet away. He came over. She turned the laptop to face him. The Halloran Foundation. Board member, Douglas Reeve. He's also on the advisory board of the Century Arts Collective, which is one of Rooted's partner organizations. We've received funding from them. Twice. The room went very quiet. Min-jae looked at the screen, then at her face. How much funding? 40,000 in total. Over 2 years. She heard her own voice, and it was steady in the way that things are steady when the emotional response is still 2 steps behind the cognitive one. Ethan introduced me to the Century Arts Collective. He set up the meeting. He told me they were... She stopped. He told me they were a good fit for our mission. The steadiness cracked, just at the edges. She felt it go, the controlled tone, the professional distance, and she pressed her fingers flat against the laptop keyboard and breathed through it, the way you breathe through the moment before something actually hurts. He put their money into Rooted, she said. Min-jae said nothing, which was the answer. He laundered money through my organization. The words came out one at a time, each one with its full weight. My nonprofit, that I built. For 3 years, Her jaw clenched. She stopped, started again. He used my work to run dirty money, and I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea. Imani, don't. The word came out hard and immediate. Don't manage this. Don't explain it to me in a way that's supposed to make it process cleanly, because it doesn't, and I need a minute. He sat back, gave her the minute. She used it, sat with the full shape of it. Not just Ethan, the ex-boyfriend who'd spent 3 years eroding her sense of herself, but Ethan, the deliberate architect, the man who'd positioned himself in her life with calculation, who'd asked questions that were data collection, who'd opened doors for her that were actually pipelines, who'd made her feel seen while using her field of vision as a map. She'd helped him without knowing it. She had built something real and good, and he had used it as infrastructure. She closed the laptop. What happens to Rooted? She asked. That depends on how this resolves, Min-jae said carefully. Tell me what that means. If the financial trail is exposed through law enforcement channels without context, Rooted gets named as a recipient of laundered funds regardless of your knowledge. The investigation becomes... It destroys us, she said. Even if I'm cleared personally, the organization? Potentially, yes. She looked at the far window. Manhattan below, indifferent as ever. Unless we control how it surfaces, she said. He looked at her. The financial architecture, she said. If we expose it ourselves, if we map the full network and bring it to the right people in the right way, with documentation that establishes the timeline and demonstrates that Rooted was a victim rather than a participant, that's a viable approach, he said, and she heard the careful precision in it, the lawyer-ish qualification of viable, which meant possible but not safe. What's the risk? That in the process of building that documentation, we surface information that moves faster than we can control it. He paused. And that Ethan, understanding that his exposure is imminent, accelerates whatever relationship he has with the Volkov. You think he'd run to them? I think a man who built his career on calculated self-preservation will make whatever calculation keeps him safest, Min-jae said. And right now the Volkov are the only people with an incentive to protect him. She absorbed that. I want to talk to him, she said. Min-jae's expression changed. No. I know how he thinks. I know every deflection he uses, every version of himself he performs when he's cornered. I can get him to confirm things that your people can't, because, no, he said again, and this time there was something harder behind it. You're not going near him, not yet. Why not yet? Because we don't know his current instructions. If the Volkov have told him to maintain his position and report back, your approaching him tells them everything they need to know about what we're doing. And if they've already decided he's a liability, he stopped. She understood what the stop meant. You're protecting him, she said, and it came out stranger than she intended. Min-jae looked at her directly. I'm protecting you, he said. The two are not the same thing. She was about to respond when Seojin appeared at Min-jae's shoulder, phone extended, expression stripped to nothing. The complete neutral of a man delivering information he would prefer not to be delivering. Min-jae took the phone, read whatever was on the screen. His face did not change, but she watched his hand, which was holding the phone, and the knuckles went briefly white before the grip relaxed. He handed the phone back to Seo-jin without a word. "What?" she said. He turned to her, and for the first time since the hotel corridor, he looked at her with something she could only describe as the expression of a man who was about to say something he didn't want to say. "The Sullivan Street location," he said. "One of our secure facilities. We evacuated it tonight after the warehouse attack, moved the assets to a secondary location." He paused. "The secondary location was compromised 20 minutes ago. 2 of our people are down. The assets are gone." "What assets?" "Financial records. Physical documentation of the Volkov's operation that we've been compiling for 6 months. Everything we had on their money structure, their contacts, their US-based operations." He said it with an evenness that she now understood cost him something. "It's gone." She felt the weight of that land across the room. "Someone told them where the secondary location was," she said. "Yes." "Someone inside?" "Yes." The room had gone very still. The men at the table were not moving, not speaking. The activity that had filled the space 20 minutes ago had drained out of it, replaced by a silence that was almost structural, that held up the ceiling. "Who knew about the secondary location?" she asked. Min-jae looked at her, and then he looked at Seo-jin, and the look between them was long and was many things, and Seo-jin held it without flinching, but without ease either. And in the half-second before Min-jae turned back to her, she understood that the question she'd just asked was the most important one in the room, and that he already had an answer he was deciding whether to say aloud. "4 people," Min-jae said. "Myself, Seo-jin, Park Jun, and—" The elevator opened. Everyone turned. Harrison, the driver from earlier, the one who had rerouted the car, stepped off the elevator, and he was not alone. Behind him came a man who moved with the specific combination of expensive clothing and visible discomfort of someone who had been brought here rather than arriving. His hair was slightly disordered. His suit jacket was gone. He looked, for the first time in the 3 years she'd known him, genuinely afraid. Ethan Caldwell looked across the penthouse and found her face, and the fear on his didn't decrease when he saw her. It changed quality, became something more complex, layered, the fear of a man who had been running 2 separate versions of himself for so long that being in the same room as both audiences simultaneously had finally become impossible to manage. "Amani," he said. Her name in his mouth after everything, after the dance floor and the corridor and the garage and the photograph and the Halloran Foundation and $40,000 and 3 years, landed differently than it had at the gala. At the gala, it had been ownership. Now it was something closer to a plea. She stood up from the couch. She did not say his name back. "Sit him down," Min-jae said to Harrison, and the quiet authority in it left no ambiguity about what kind of room this was and what kind of man was running it. Ethan sat, and Amani looked at him across the spare, controlled space of the penthouse. This man she had loved, who had loved her in the way that uses people, who had walked into her life with calculation she'd mistaken for connection. And she felt something she hadn't expected. Not grief, which she'd already done in the car. Not rage, which would come later, she suspected, in a private moment when she could afford it. What she felt was clarity, the specific, cold, operational clarity of someone who has just understood exactly what they're dealing with and exactly what it's going to take to deal with. She pulled a chair from against the wall, set it directly across from where Ethan was sitting, and sat down in it. Not across a table. There was no table between them. Just 4 feet of open air and the full weight of her attention, and the specific quality of stillness she'd borrowed unconsciously from the man standing behind her. "Start talking," she said. Ethan looked past her at Min-jae, the instinct of a man who defaults to addressing the most powerful person in the room. "Look at me," Amani said. Flat. Final. He looked at her. "How long?" she said. His jaw worked. "Amani, there are things you don't—" "Long, Ethan." "A breath?" "The Volkov connection started about 2 years ago. Before that the money was coming from other sources, less organized." "The Century Arts Collective." She watched his face when she said it, watched the calculation fire behind his eyes. How much did she know? How much to give? What version of this could he construct that left him the most room? She knew that calculation. She'd watched it operate for 3 years without knowing what she was seeing. "The collective was one vehicle," he said carefully. "There were others. And rooted. Silence. Say it, she said. The Halloran donation it was structured to move through a legitimate recipient. Your organization had a clean record, strong documentation. Say that it was my organization, she said. Say the name. Rooted, he said. Yes. She sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and stood with her back to the room and her forehead almost touching the cold glass and the city below her running on its own indifferent logic. And she breathed, in, out, until the thing that was trying to break open in her chest stayed contained. Then she turned back around. Who inside this organization told the Volkov about the secondary location tonight? She said. Not to Ethan. To the room, Min-jae answered. That's what we're here to find out. Ethan's eyes moved. Small movement, reflexive. Toward the elevator, toward the exits. The unconscious mapping of a man who suddenly understood that the room he was in had no convenient doors. Amani saw it. You knew, she said. You knew about the secondary location. I don't know what you knew, because whoever your contact is inside this operation told you, and you passed it to the Volkov. She crossed back to the chair and sat down again, leaning forward, elbows on knees, and her voice dropped to something quieter and more dangerous than shouting. Ethan, I know you. I know exactly how you sound when you're performing innocence versus when you're actually surprised. This, she gestured at his face, is performance. The room was absolutely still. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then something in him appeared to make a decision. She could see it, the internal mechanism shifting, the calculation resolving, and the performance dropped. Not all of it, but enough. I passed information twice, he said. In the last week, I didn't know what it would be used for. 3 people are dead, Min-jae said from behind Amani. His voice was very quiet. I didn't know it would. 3 people, Min-jae said again, and the repetition was not for emphasis. It was the specific verbal discipline of a man keeping himself in a room that part of him had already left. Ethan's throat moved. I was told it was a precaution, a contingency, that they needed to know the location in case negotiations broke down and they needed a name, Min-jae said. Give me the name of your contact. If I give you that name, You're already past the point where your safety is a separate negotiation, Min-jae said. The Volkov know you're here. They know Harrison brought you in. Whatever protection you imagined they were providing ends the moment they decide you're a liability, which, given that you're currently sitting in my building, is probably already decided. Ethan's face went through several things in rapid succession. He gave a name. Imani didn't recognize it. But across the room, Seojin's face shifted. A small, controlled shift, the kind that communicated everything to the people who knew how to read it. Min-jae looked at Seojin for 1 second. Then he looked away, and the operational part of the evening accelerated, and Imani sat back in her chair and felt the exhaustion arrive. Not gradually, but all at once. The way exhaustion comes when the adrenaline finally stops lying about the body's actual condition. Her feet hurt. Her shoulders hurt. The emerald dress felt wrong now. Felt like something worn by a different woman who'd walked into a different evening, and she became suddenly and acutely aware that it was past 2 a.m, and she'd been running on shock and anger for hours. She stood, walked to the window again, and this time she didn't press her forehead to the glass. She just stood and looked out at the city and listened to the room behind her disassemble and reassemble itself around new information. Min-jae appeared beside her. I need you to trust me for the next 12 hours, he said. That's a large ask. I know. You have a traitor in your operation. Had, he said, past tense. She looked at him sideways. His face told her nothing beyond what he chose to show, but she was getting better at reading the negative space, the things not shown, the words not said. What are you going to do? Manage it, he said, which was not an answer, and they both knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise. And Ethan? A pause. He stays here tonight. Tomorrow he makes a formal statement to a federal contact I trust. His cooperation is the only currency he has left, and he knows it. She looked at the reflection of the room in the dark glass of the window. The men, the laptops, Ethan sitting with his elbows on his knees and his expensive suit and his dismantled certainty. And she thought about the woman who'd stood at the threshold of the Whitmore ballroom 6 hours ago in an emerald dress, debating whether she'd made a mistake. I need to sleep, she said. There's a room, second door on the left. He paused. I'll have someone bring you something to change into. Thank you, she said. She started to move, then stopped. The 48 hours. The Volkov's deadline. What's the actual plan? Tomorrow, he said, when you've slept. She turned and looked at him fully. Don't manage me. I'm not managing you, he said. I'm telling you that what I have right now is incomplete, and I don't give people incomplete information and call it a plan. Tomorrow, it will be complete. She held his gaze. All right, she said finally. She walked to the room he'd indicated, and the door closed behind her, and the city ran on outside the window, and Amani Brooks lay on top of an unfamiliar bed in a stranger's penthouse and stared at the ceiling and waited for sleep that took a very long time to come. It came. And then the morning did. She was awake before anyone knocked. Old habit. She'd always been a light sleeper, the kind who surfaced easily and fully, without the gradual assembly process that other people described. She was awake, and she was thinking, and the previous night had not softened with sleep the way some things did. It sat in her chest with the same hard clarity it had arrived with. Someone had left clothes outside the door. Simple, correct size, which told her something about Min Jae's attention to operational detail, or possibly just the efficiency of his people. She changed, washed her face in the attached bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Not the long, complicated looks she used to give herself. The inventory of insufficiencies that 3 years with Ethan had trained her to perform. Just a look. Just checking that the person in the mirror was still the same person who had walked into a party the night before. She was. Different information, same person. She went out. The penthouse in daylight was different. The city through the glass was gray-bright, overcast, the East River pewter-colored under a sky that couldn't decide on rain. Min Jae was at the table, already working, dressed in dark clothes that had replaced the suit. He looked like he hadn't slept, but he also looked like sleep deprivation was something he'd long since incorporated into normal operating conditions. Seo Jin was gone. 2 different men were in the space instead. Ethan was not visible, presumably in one of the other rooms. Min Jae looked up when she came in. Coffee, he said, nodding toward the kitchen area. She poured a cup and brought it to the table and sat across from him. Tell me the plan. He turned the laptop to face her. On the screen was a map of the Brooklyn waterfront, specifically the industrial zone south of the Navy Yard, a stretch of shuttered warehouses and shipping infrastructure that the borough's development boom hadn't reached yet. He pointed to a specific cluster of buildings near the water's edge. The Volkov's primary U.S. operation runs through a shipping and import business called Tarkington Maritime, he said. Legitimate front, about 60% of the actual volume is clean cargo. The rest is not. Tonight, the Volkov are expecting a meeting. He paused. They're going to get one. You're going to the meeting. We're going to manage the meeting, he said. The location is a terminal they control on the waterfront. They chose it because they believe it gives them the tactical advantage. Contained, isolated, difficult approach from any direction. And they've been using that terminal for 8 months while my people have been installing infrastructure in the surrounding buildings that they don't know about. A flat pause. The tactical advantage is ours. You've been planning this. I've been preparing contingencies, he said. The Volkov forcing a meeting is one of several scenarios I planned for. She studied the map. Where do I fit in this? He looked at her steadily. The financial documentation we lost last night. The physical records at the secondary location. We have digital copies of approximately 70% of it. The remaining 30% is irreplaceable. He paused. But there's another path. Ethan's cooperation, combined with what you found last night on the Halloran Foundation structure, gives us enough to reconstruct the network map. If we can compile that documentation and transmit it to my federal contact before the meeting tonight, the Volkov's financial infrastructure gets frozen simultaneously with the physical confrontation. You want to hit them on both fronts at once. Cut off the money and cut off the operation at the same moment, he said. Either alone is recoverable. Both together isn't. She looked at the map, looked at him. And my organization? Your federal contact receives the full timeline simultaneously. The documentation establishing Rooted as a victim of the scheme, not a participant. Your organization is named in the filing but protected by context. He paused. It's the best outcome available. Best outcome available, she said. Not best outcome. No, he agreed. There will be scrutiny. There will be a period of difficulty, but Rooted survives intact. That's what I can offer. She thought about her 12 staff members, the young women in the mentorship program, the grants they'd won legitimately, the work they'd done, the doors they'd opened. The thing Ethan had used as infrastructure was also, underneath the contamination, the real thing she'd built. It was both simultaneously, and she needed it to survive. All right, she said, let's build the document. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Amani at one laptop, Min-jae at another. Ethan brought out under supervision and required to answer specific questions about specific transactions. His lawyer's memory for financial detail turned against itself, all that careful construction now being used to dismantle what he'd built. He answered questions without resistance. The performance was completely gone now, burned off sometime in the night. What was left was a man who had run his calculations and understood that cooperation was the only remaining variable he controlled. She didn't speak to him beyond the requirements of the work. He didn't try to speak to her. By 3 p.m, the document was complete. Min-jae transmitted it through encrypted channels to a federal agent named Weller, whose relationship with Min-jae she didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. Weller's response came back in 11 minutes. Received, processing, freeze orders being prepared. The clock on the wall read 3:22 p.m. The meeting at the waterfront terminal was set for midnight. The storm arrived at 8. It came in from the Atlantic with the particular aggression of a late-season system that had built momentum over open water. Not the gray drizzle of a normal New York rain, but something with force and direction, rain that moved horizontally when the wind took it, that turned the streets into something between road and river. The waterfront took it worst. Out at the industrial edge of Brooklyn, where the buildings were low and the open space between them gave the weather nothing to brake against, the storm ran unchecked. Min-jae's convoy left the Upper East Side at 10 p.m. 3 vehicles, route changed twice in transit. Amani was in the second car. She had not planned to be. The argument had happened at 8:30, while the storm was still building, in the main room of the penthouse with the rain throwing itself at the glass and the city lights fragmented and wild behind it. You're staying here, Min-jae had said. Weller has 2 people on their way. I'm not sitting in a penthouse while... This isn't a negotiation. You're right, it's not, she said. I'm telling you what I'm doing. I'm not asking permission. The financial documentation, if something goes wrong with the transmission, if Weller's people need additional verification, I'm the one who can speak to the rooted records directly. I'm the only person who can do that. You know this. He looked at her for a long moment. She could feel the calculation. The same rapid variable assessment she'd seen him do at the gala, on the balcony, in the parking garage. She stood inside it and didn't flinch. You stay in the vehicle unless I say otherwise, he said finally. Agreed. If it goes wrong, Harrison gets you out, no argument. Agreed. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned and started preparing, and she understood that the agreement was also a kind of acknowledgement, that she was not a liability to be managed, not a complication, not cargo, that she was a person making an informed choice about her own involvement in the thing her life had been pulled into. The convoy drove south through the storm-hammered city. The terminal appeared through the rain as a cluster of dark structures against a darker sky, the water beyond them invisible in the weather but present as sound. The heave of it against the pilings, the deep irregular percussion of the storm-driven harbor. Loading cranes stood against the sky like abandoned equipment from a larger, older industry. Somewhere in the complex, lights burned behind corrugated walls. The vehicles stopped 200 meters from the terminal entrance. Min-jae got out. His people organized around him with the fluid precision she'd seen in the parking garage, the choreography of men who'd trained for exactly this. The rain hitting them and meaning nothing, the dark meaning nothing, each person moving to a pre-assigned position without instruction. Seo-jin was here, which meant the name Ethan had given last night had resolved in a direction that left Seo-jin standing on the right side of it. Min-jae came to her window. She lowered it. Rain immediately hit her face, cold and direct. The Volkov have 8 confirmed men inside, he said. Dmitry Volkov is present. That's confirmed by surveillance. This ends tonight one way or another. I know, she said. He looked at her. And in the rain and the dark, with the storm running around them and the terminal lights burning 200 meters ahead, his face held something she hadn't seen on it before. Not the controlled neutral. Not the almost expression, something that had broken through the surface of the discipline and was visible for the specific duration that the situation didn't allow him to maintain it. Thank you, he said. For last night. For today. For... He stopped. The sentence didn't finish, but it didn't need to. She held his gaze in the rain. Go end it, she said. He went. She watched him walk toward the terminal with his people moving around him, the rain making everything gray and indistinct, and she held her phone in her hand with Weller's direct line on the screen and listened to the storm and waited. The first shot came from inside the terminal at 12:07 a.m., then the second, and then the sound multiplied and the terminal lights blew out and Harrison's hand was on the gear shift and Imani said very clearly, "Not yet," and pressed the phone to her ear. Weller picked up on the first ring. "The freeze orders," she said. "Are they in place?" "Processing," Weller said. "We need confirmation of the Tarkington Maritime account number, the primary operating account. The documentation listed a subsidiary. We need the parent." She knew it. She knew it because she'd spent 12 hours today building the financial map, and she'd cross-referenced that specific account 3 times. She gave him the number. "Confirmed," Weller said. "Freeze is executing. 2 minutes." Inside the terminal, the sound was not stopping. Harrison turned to look at her. His face said everything his professionalism wouldn't let him say out loud. That they should be moving, that this was past the point where staying was defensible, that his instructions were to protect her, and he intended to follow them. 2 minutes, she said to him. He didn't move. She watched the terminal. The rain, the dark. Her phone buzzed. Weller. Freeze confirmed. All Tarkington accounts locked. Federal team en route, ETA 9 minutes. She exhaled. Then the terminal's main doors blew open. Not an explosion, just force. Both doors thrown wide simultaneously. And figures were moving, and the rain received them, and somewhere in the dark and the wet and the storm-hammered silence between shots, she was trying to find the one silhouette she recognized among all the ones she didn't, trying to find him. And the 9 minutes felt like a geography she wasn't sure anyone could cross in 9 minutes. Harrison, she said, get me closer. Ma'am, my instructions are, I know your instructions. Get me closer. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She looked back. Whatever he found in her face made him put the car in drive. He moved the vehicle forward 200 feet and stopped at the edge of the terminal's outer perimeter, where the chain-link fence had been cut and folded back. Min Jae's people earlier, preparation she hadn't known about. Through the windshield in the rain, she could see the terminal's interior through the blown-open doors, the strobing of muzzle flash, the movement of figures she couldn't identify at this distance. And she sat forward with both hands on the back of the front seat and watched with everything she had and tried to breathe. Her phone rang. Weller. Federal team is 7 minutes out, he said. We have eyes on the terminal via satellite. I need you to stay in the vehicle. I'm in the vehicle. Ms. Brooks, I'm in the vehicle, she said again, and hung up. The rain hit the car in waves. Harrison had both hands on the wheel, even though the car wasn't moving, the instinct of a man prepared to move in any direction on no notice. Outside, the harbor was invisible behind the weather, but she could hear it. The heave and slap of storm-driven water against the pilings, the deep structural groan of the terminal in the wind. Then the shooting stopped, not gradually. All at once, the way a switch gets thrown. The terminal went quiet except for the rain and the wind and the harbor. And the silence was somehow louder than everything that had preceded it. And Imani sat in the back of the car with her heart hammering at the base of her throat and counted the seconds and waited. Figures emerged from the terminal doors. She was out of the car before Harrison could react. Her hand on the door handle, the door open, the rain hitting her immediately and completely, soaking through the clothes someone had provided at the penthouse, the cold of it immediate and total. Harrison was out of the driver's side in the same motion, not grabbing her, not restraining her, just moving with her, one step behind, because the situation had passed the point where restraint was the functional response. She walked toward the terminal. 2 of Min Jae's men emerged first, supporting a third between them. One of the men from the convoy. She didn't know his name, his left arm at a wrong angle, his face white under the rain. Behind them came 2 more, moving fast, not injured. Then Seo Jin, phone already at his ear, scanning the perimeter. And then Min Jae. He was walking on his own, which was the first thing she registered, and she felt the thing that had been clenched in her chest for the last 9 minutes release with a force that almost took her off her feet. He was upright, moving, his own momentum, but he was holding his right side with his left hand, and even in the rain and the dark, she could see the dark stain spreading through the fabric between his fingers. He saw her and stopped. "I told you to stay in the vehicle," he said. "You're shot," she said. "I'm aware." "How bad?" He looked down at his hand against his side, then back up at her. His face was... She cataloged it without meaning to, some part of her mind still running the reader of people function she'd developed over years of nonprofit work, years of rooms full of people performing things. His face was in pain. Real pain, not performed, the specific flatness that falls over a person's features when the body is managing something significant and the conscious mind is being allocated elsewhere. But his eyes were clear and present and focused entirely on her. "Through and through," he said. "Manageable." "That's not Imani." Her name, in his mouth, in the rain, at the edge of a terminal where something she didn't yet fully understand had just finished happening. "I'm standing." She looked at him. He was standing. She put that fact in her body and held it there. "Dmitry Volkov," she said, "in custody. Weller's people will find him inside when they arrive." A pause. "2 of his men didn't make it. The rest surrendered." "Your people?" "1 serious, 3 minor." His jaw moved. "We got them out." Behind him, from inside the terminal, she could hear a sound she recognized after a moment as someone being moved on a hard floor, the scrape and groan of it, and she understood without being told that the serious injury was being managed in there by people who knew how to manage it, that there was a system running and she was standing at its edges. The federal vehicles arrived 4 minutes later. 3 of them, dark and unmarked, moving fast down the access road with their lights cutting through the rain. Weller got out of the first one, and he was younger than his voice had suggested, mid-40s, a face that had been through a significant number of difficult situations and worn them into something that looked less like hardness and more like patience. He looked at Min Jae. Min Jae looked at him. Something passed between them that was long and complicated and had clearly been accumulating for a period of time much longer than tonight. "You're hit," Weller said. "Noted," Min Jae said. "My people?" "Inside. Volkov is secured." Min Jae paused. "The financial freeze held? All accounts locked as of 12:09, Weller said. "Tarkington Maritime, 12 subsidiary vehicles, the 3 nonprofit fronts. Everything the documentation covered." He glanced at Imani briefly. "The rooted filing went through with the protective context intact. My office will need a formal statement from Ms. Brooks in the next 72 hours, but the organization's standing is protected pending that." She exhaled, long and slow, the breath going all the way out. "Thank you," she said to Weller. He looked at her with the steady, unsentimental acknowledgement of a man who gave credit accurately. "You built the map," he said. "We just executed against it." Then he walked into the terminal, and his people moved around her and Min Jae, and the machinery of consequence began its work. The arrests and the documentation and the careful procedural dismantling of what the Volkov had built in this city over 12 years in one rain-soaked night at the edge of the harbor. Min Jae's driver appeared at his shoulder with a first aid kit and a look of contained urgency. Min Jae allowed himself to be steered toward the second vehicle, and Imani walked beside him, and nobody said anything for a minute, and the rain kept coming. At the car, he stopped and turned to her. "You gave Weller the account number," he said. "You heard that?" Seojin had eyes on the vehicle. He reported it. He looked at her. "The freeze might not have executed in time without it." "It was in the document," she said. "I just knew where to find it." "You knew because you spent 12 hours building something you didn't have to build," he said. "You could have stayed at the penthouse. You had every reason to." She looked at him in the rain. His hand was still against his side. His face was still in pain. His eyes were still completely present. "It was my work he used," she said. "My organization, my 3 years." She paused. "I wasn't going to let that be the end of the story." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he got into the vehicle, slowly and with the controlled deliberateness of a man managing a body that was asking loudly for different treatment than he was giving it, and she got in after him, and Harrison closed the door, and the rain ran down the windows, and the terminal receded behind them as they drove. The weeks that followed were not clean. Clean was for stories that ended at the terminal, that let the rain wash everything smooth and the morning arrive with resolution already installed. The actual weeks were procedural and exhausting, and full of the specific unglamorous work of aftermath, federal statements, legal consultations, the careful reconstruction of Rooted's financial records under the protective framework that Weller's filing had established. Amani gave her formal statement on a Tuesday morning in a federal building in Lower Manhattan, sitting across a table from two investigators who asked the same questions in slightly different configurations for 4 hours. And she answered all of them. And when it was over, she walked out into the November street and stood in the cold for a moment and felt, not relief exactly, but the particular weight of a thing being finished. Her board of directors met in emergency session. She told them everything, not the version edited for stakeholder comfort, but the actual version, with its full texture of how it had happened and what she'd found and what she'd done about it. 3 board members wanted to issue an immediate public statement distancing the organization from any association with the investigation. She talked them out of it. The strength of Rooted's position came from transparency, she argued, from the documented fact that they'd been victimized and had actively participated in the exposure of the scheme. Distance looked like guilt. Transparency looked like integrity. The board voted. Transparency won, 5-3. The public statement went out on a Wednesday. The coverage was not gentle, and it was not brief. The story had too many elements that the city's media found irresistible. The criminal network and the charity fronts and the attorney and the gala and all of it. But the framing held. Rooted was named as a victim organization. The documentation was thorough. The narrative was controlled in the way that narratives can be controlled when the people inside them have told the truth completely and left nothing for anyone else to discover. They lost 2 funders. They gained 4. The net effect, 3 months out, was a stronger organization with a higher public profile than it had carried before, and Amani sat with the irony of that without trying to resolve it. It didn't need resolving. It was just true, one of those true things that refused to be only one thing. Ethan Caldwell's cooperation agreement was finalized in December. He gave federal investigators 14 months of financial records, 3 contact names within the Volkov's U.S. operation, and full documentation of the money-moving architecture he'd built. In exchange, he received a reduced charge and a sentence recommendation that his attorney described, to the press, as appropriate given the level of cooperation. He resigned from his firm the same day the agreement was announced. Amani heard about it through Dara, who had followed every development with the focused intensity of someone who felt personally implicated by the story and needed to understand all of it. She didn't reach out to Ethan. She didn't avoid reaching out either. She simply found, when she examined the impulse honestly, that she had nothing to say to him that wasn't already said. Not by her, specifically. By the documentation, by the federal record, by the collapsed architecture of everything he'd built. It had all been said. What remained when she let the anger cool to its actual temperature was something more complicated than contempt. She'd loved him. That was true, and it stayed true even after everything, because love doesn't retroactively reclassify itself based on new information. It just becomes part of a larger picture that the person who loved has to decide what to do with. She decided to put it down, not deny it, not rewrite it, just set it on a shelf where it could exist as history without continuing to function as wound. That took longer than the federal process, but it happened. Min-jae healed. The wound had been through and through, as he'd said, a clean passage, no major vessels, the kind of injury that a trauma surgeon can manage without drama, and that the body, given sufficient time and the kind of medical attention available to a man with Min-jae's resources, recovers from in a matter of weeks. He was out of the hospital in 4 days. He walked with a slight favoring of his right side for another 2 weeks, and then stopped. She knew this because she saw him. Not immediately. Not in the first week when the federal process was at its most intensive, and her attention was necessarily elsewhere. But 3 weeks after the terminal, he called. Not texted. Called. In the direct way that was consistent with everything she'd observed about how he operated. "I'd like to see you, Khan," he said. "I'm aware that's what a phone call means," she said. A pause. Then, "Are you available Thursday?" "Thursday afternoon," she said. They met at a small restaurant on the Lower East Side. Her neighborhood, her choice of location, a point she hadn't made explicitly, but that he'd understood from the suggestion without requiring explanation. He arrived exactly on time. He looked not the same as he'd looked at the gala, which was performance, and not the same as he'd looked at the terminal, which was survival. He looked like himself, in the way that people sometimes look like themselves only when the surrounding pressure has been removed and what's underneath gets some air. He sat across from her and looked at her and didn't say anything immediately, and she waited. How is the organization? He said. Recovering, she said. Better than I expected. The public response was, she considered it. People respond to honesty, more than I sometimes remember. They respond to you, he said, specifically. She looked at him. I read your statement, he said, the one to the press. You could have made it clinical, kept yourself out of the personal dimension of it. You didn't. Keeping myself out of it would have been a lie by omission, she said. I was in a relationship with the man who did this. That's part of the story. Pretending it isn't would have made everything else feel like it was pretending too. He nodded slowly. And the board? Managed. Eventually. She looked at him across the small table. You said you wanted to see me. What did you want to say? He held her gaze. Several things. Start with one. I'm dismantling the operation, he said. She went still. The criminal infrastructure, he said, as if clarity were required, though she'd understood him perfectly. The logistics networks, the distribution arrangements, everything that isn't legitimate. I've been in the process of converting the legitimate holdings into clean businesses for the last several years. The rest, he paused. After the terminal, I finished the calculation. What calculation? Whether the cost was worth the architecture, he said. I've been running this for 15 years. I built it because I understood it, because I was good at it, because when you arrive somewhere with nothing, a 20-year-old in a city that doesn't know your name, you use the skills available to you. He stopped. But Park was 24 years old. He'd been with us for 8 months. And I looked at his family after the terminal and I couldn't... He stopped again. The sentence didn't finish. She didn't rush it. I couldn't find the calculation that made that worth it anymore, he said. I've been trying for 3 weeks. It's not there. She looked at him for a long time. Not measuring, not assessing for lies. She'd spent enough time reading the texture of how he said things to know the difference between performance and the real thing. And this was the real thing, worn down to its actual material. What does dismantling look like? She asked. Long, he said. Careful. Several years, probably. There are relationships that don't end cleanly, and people who need other arrangements made before I can step away from obligations. He paused. I have a lawyer, not Caldwell's variety. Someone clean, who works in legitimate restructuring. And Weller? A slight shift in his expression. There's an ongoing conversation, he said, which she understood as yes, there are terms, and they are being negotiated, and that is all I'm able to say in a restaurant on the Lower East Side. She nodded. You didn't have to tell me this, she said. I wanted to, he said. I wanted you to know the direction. Why? He looked at her directly, in the way she'd first seen him look at her on the dance floor, without agenda, without the performed versions of things, with the full attention of someone choosing to see and be seen. Because you're the reason I finished the calculation, he said. Not the only reason, but the reason I finished it when I did. She sat with that. Let it settle without rushing to respond to it, because it deserved to be sat with. I'm not going to pretend the last month was normal, she said finally, or that everything that happened was something other than what it was. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm not ready to... She stopped, chose the words. I'm in the middle of rebuilding something, my organization, and some internal things that I don't have clean language for yet. I'm in the middle of that, and I can't... I know, he said. I'm not saying no to... She stopped again. I'm saying I need the middle to be the middle, not compressed into a resolution before it's actually done. Yes, he said, simply, without negotiation. She looked at him. You're very calm about that. I've been waiting longer for more difficult things, he said. She almost laughed. Almost. The same qualities she'd observed in him, she realized, the genuine thing pressing up against the surface and then controlled, and she understood that she'd borrowed it without noticing, that some of his particular discipline had transferred in the weeks of proximity. She didn't suppress it this time. She let it come. Not a full laugh, but a real one, brief and unguarded, the kind that arrives from somewhere honest. He watched it happen. And his face, the composed, controlled, carefully managed face that she had spent weeks learning to read in its negative spaces and micro-shifts, did the thing it had only done twice at the gala. It opened. Not dramatically, not into something demonstrative, just the specific opening of a person who has been holding something for a long time, and, in the presence of the right thing, lets it be held by the room instead. They sat in the small restaurant for 2 hours and talked. Not about the terminal or the federal case or Ethan or the Volkov, but about other things. About the city, about the 15 years he'd spent in it and the 31 she had, about her mother, who lived in Crown Heights and called every Sunday and had not yet been told the full story of the last month, about his, who was still in Seoul and to whom he spoke every 2 weeks and who asked the same questions each time with the patient repetition of a woman who had decided that asking was better than not asking, about what Rooted was going to look like in a year if things went the way she was working to make them go, about what legitimate looked like from the inside after 15 years of building something that wasn't. Not everything was resolved, not everything had language yet. The middle was still the middle, but they sat in it together, which was a different thing than sitting in it alone. 4 months later, the Manhattan Legacy Foundation held its annual spring gala in the same Whitmore Hotel ballroom where everything had begun. Imani almost didn't go. She stood in her apartment on the evening of it, looking at the invitation on her kitchen counter, and thought about the last time she'd stood at a threshold and debated whether to walk through it, and what had been waiting on the other side. She thought about the emerald dress, which was hanging in her closet, unworn since that night, not because she'd decided against it, but because she hadn't decided for it yet, and the decision felt like it needed to be made rather than defaulted into. She wore the emerald dress. She walked into the ballroom, and the chandeliers were the same, and the orchestra was the same, and the room was full of the same architecture of New York power operating on its own complicated logic. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She breathed. Dara found her within 3 minutes, gold dress, second drink already in hand, same fundamental energy. "You look," Dara started. "Don't say brave," Imani said. Dara laughed. "I was going to say exactly right," she said. "Which is different." They circulated. Imani spoke with the Legacy Foundation's executive director about the spring programming cycle. She shook hands with 2 potential new funders. She talked about Rooted in the present tense, in the future tense, not the past tense, not the defensive tense, not the apologetic tense of the weeks immediately after the public statement. It was what it was, a thing she'd built that had survived being used as a weapon against itself, and was therefore, in the way that things that survive are, stronger in the specific places it had been stressed. She was standing near the edge of the room in a conversation about arts programming in the outer boroughs when she saw him. He was across the room, near the far windows, dressed in a dark suit with the same top button open configuration as the last time, the same single concession to the event's dress code, the same signal of a man present on his own terms. He wasn't looking for her. He was in conversation with someone, listening with the full attention she recognized, and he didn't see her for a moment, and she had the unusual experience of watching him without his knowledge. He looked like a man who had put something down. Not empty. The opposite of empty, actually. The kind of presence that comes when a person is no longer spending energy on the maintenance of something unsustainable, and the freed energy has nowhere to go but into actually being present in the room. He looked like himself, in the way she'd seen at the restaurant, and she understood that she was watching the direction he'd described made visible, not finished, not resolved, but genuinely moving. He turned, found her across the room the way eyes find things they've been unconsciously oriented toward. They looked at each other across the length of the ballroom. He said something brief to the person he'd been speaking with and moved through the room toward her, the crowd parting the way it always did around him without requiring anything of him, and she stayed where she was and let him come. And when he reached her, the distance between them was the same 4 feet it had been on the dance floor 5 months ago, and the orchestra was playing something slow, and the chandeliers were throwing their gold light across everything the same way they had then. "Imani," he said. "Minjae," she said back. A beat. "The dress," he said. "I know," she said. "It's—" He stopped. Something in his expression, not the almost smile now, but the actual thing, the real version, worn openly without the 2-second discipline. "You should wear it more often." She looked at him. "I intend to." The orchestra settled into its tempo, and around them the gala moved through its elegant rotations, indifferent to the specific gravitational field that existed in the 4 feet between 2 people who had been through something together and come out the other side, not unmarked, but intact. He extended his hand. She looked at it, the hand she'd grabbed in desperation 5 months ago, the hand that had steadied her through a waltz while her heart was hammering, the hand that had held a phone with a photograph of her building and gone briefly, completely white at the knuckles before the grip relaxed. She knew that hand now. She took it. They walked onto the floor together. Not escaping anything this time, not performing anything for anyone watching, not driven by panic or strategy or the arithmetic of survival. Just two people choosing, in full knowledge of what choice meant, to step into the same space. The music moved through the room and they moved with it. And New York ran on outside the Whitmore's tall windows, loud and indifferent and entirely itself. And Imani Brooks danced in an emerald dress and felt, not the performed confidence of a woman proving something, not the desperate calm of a woman surviving something, but the actual thing. The thing underneath all the performance and the survival and the work and the fear and the rebuilding. Herself. Present. Held. Not by someone else's grip, but by her own. His hand was at her waist, and he was looking at her, and the music was almost enough to explain it, but not quite. And she thought about a woman who had stood at a threshold in the same room 5 months ago and wondered whether the dress was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was never a mistake. It was just the beginning of a story she hadn't had the full text of yet. Now she did.